At precisely 5 to 12 a.m., under a sky still half asleep and tinged with gray, 17-year-old Elijah Grant sat at the kitchen table of apartment 8C in East Baltimore, nervously flipping the edges of his spiral notebook. He was dressed for school, neatly pressed khakis, white shirt, shoes spotless. Across from him, his mother, Camille Grant, poured instant coffee into a chipped mug, wearing exhaustion on her face like makeup. She had just returned from her night shift as a data entry officer at Draper and Langston, her robe tied tight, eyes heavy. This wasn't a glamorous life, but it was theirs, small, worn, but honest. "You've been reading that Constitution again?" Camille asked, trying to smile. "Just brushing up on the Fourth Amendment," Elijah replied. "You know, unreasonable searches and seizures." She chuckled, but something about it was brittle. "Well, make sure your locker's clean then, genius." But before another word could pass between them, the door exploded open. In a matter of seconds, their quiet morning shattered. The hinges screamed, the wood splintered. 6 officers in tactical gear stormed the room like a SWAT drill, barking commands and waving loaded weapons, as if they'd walked into a cartel hideout. One rifle trained directly on Elijah's chest. "Don't shoot, Hess, just a boy," Camille shouted, hands raised in panic. But her voice was background noise to them. "Camille Grant, you are under arrest for theft of proprietary corporate data and obstruction of an internal investigation." Elijah sat frozen in his seat, unable to speak, his world crashing in slow motion. 2 officers grabbed his mother, twisting her arms behind her back with surgical detachment. "You have the right to remain silent." "I don't even have access to that system after 6 p.m., Camille protested. "Ask my supervisor. I didn't do anything." But they didn't ask. They didn't check. They didn't listen. What followed wasn't a search. It was a desecration. Bookshelf overturned. Cabinets torn open. Her recipe cards strewn across the floor. Elijah's notebooks and school papers spilled out, soaked with spilled coffee and the residue of chaos. It wasn't just a home invasion. It was a declaration, "You're guilty until proven innocent." As Camille was dragged away, wrists bound in cold metal, she called over her shoulder, "Call Mrs. Raines next door. Stay with her." And then her voice cracked with something even deeper than fear, resolve. Elijah don't get involved. But he already was. What he had seen, how they spoke to her, how they shoved her, how the white sergeant muttered to another, "They're all the same welfare queens in business suits," was already etched into his mind. His mother had never taken a single cent of welfare. She worked double shifts. She paid taxes. She raised him alone and with pride. And in an instant, none of it had mattered. When the door slammed shut behind them, silence filled the apartment, not just the silence of sound, but the kind that screamed louder than any siren. Elijah didn't cry. He didn't panic. He stood still for a long moment, then knelt on the floor and picked up his spiral notebook, now torn and creased but intact. Inside, scrawled in bold black ink, were the names of landmark court cases he had copied down just the week before: Brady v. Maryland, Miranda versus Arizona, Gideon v. Wainwright. He hadn't known then why he wrote them down, but now he did. That was the moment everything changed. Not just for Camille, but for Elijah. Because the system had touched the wrong child, and the child was taking notes. Elijah didn't return to school that morning. The world outside still moved cars, honked buses, hissed to a stop. Morning shows droned on TV screens in corner store. But for Elijah, the world had tilted off its axis. His mother was gone, and nobody was asking the right questions. He stood outside apartment 8B for a moment before knocking. Mrs. Raines opened the door before he even touched it. The 60-something-year-old widow had raised 3 children of her own and buried one. Her eyes were sharp, her faith unwavering. "Come in, baby," she said, voice soft. "Come in." She made tea, the kind that was bitter and strong, poured into a ceramic cup she swore dated back to the 60s. Elijah sat on her floral print couch, staring straight ahead. "She didn't do anything," he said, barely above a whisper. Mrs. Raines placed a hand over his. "And you know that," she replied, "but they don't need truth, sweetheart. They need a target. Your mama became the story before she had a chance to speak it." After a long silence, Elijah opened his notebook. His thumb brushed across the name Brady v. Maryland, again slower this time. Then he turned to a blank page and started to write, not thoughts, but a plan. By noon, he was walking through the heavy glass doors of the Baltimore City Library, the main branch with tall, arched windows and marble floors that echoed each step like a courtroom's gavel. His school bag hung loosely on his shoulder, his shoes still clean, but his face had changed. The innocence had peeled back. He went straight to the law section. Not because he was told to, because he had to. He scanned the spines of thick federal volumes: criminal procedure, state veer, Harper civil rights in the workplace, digital evidence in chain of custody. These weren't books for kids, but Elijah wasn't just any kid, and this wasn't just any day. He chose a corner table near the back, where the overhead lights hummed and the world felt smaller, contained, and safe. He laid his spiral notebook down like a blueprint and pulled a thick volume toward him. For hours he read and copied. His handwriting was small, methodical. He underlined statutes about probable cause, circled words like malicious prosecution and suppression of evidence. He made timelines and diagrams: what time his mother was arrested when she supposedly accessed the data, and how her access card was revoked nightly by protocol. As the afternoon sun shifted across the floor, a voice interrupted him. "Don't kids have school today?" Elijah flinched. He looked up into the curious, not quite smiling face of a woman in her 50s, sharp glasses resting on her nose, a gray cardigan hanging over her shoulders. Her name tag read, Ms. Alvarez. "I had a family emergency," he said, tone flat but polite. She didn't push. Instead, she placed a bottle of water and a granola bar beside his notebook. "Hydrate," she said. "That brain looks like it runs hotter than most." He gave a tiny nod. Gratitude without words. She didn't hover, but she watched him move from one case to another with the fluency of someone who had been here before, except she knew he hadn't. An hour later, she returned. This time, she pulled up a chair. "My brother," she said quietly, "was locked up in '92. They said he stole a car. Problem is, he was with me all night. Didn't matter. No one listened. No one asked. He did 4 years before the evidence came out." Elijah looked up. What changed? Someone found a print, buried in the wrong folder. 4 years too late. He said nothing, but she saw the understanding in his eyes. "They make it hard on us," she said, "especially if we don't know the language they use to hurt us." "I want to learn it," Elijah said softly, "so they can't lie in it anymore." Ms. Alvarez looked at him carefully. "Then you'll need more than books." That afternoon, she pulled strings, got him guest access to Westlaw, LexisNexis, local public records, and archived rulings. She didn't ask too many questions. She only gave him a password, a quiet nod, and the unspoken truth: this kid was doing something the adults had failed to do. Fight back smart. Elijah dug in. He started with Hudson versus Michigan, cross-referenced it with the state's own policies on search warrants. He realized the officers had breached entry without presenting a signed warrant, and that no physical evidence had been shown before Camille was arrested. Worse, the so-called anonymous tip wasn't detailed or verified, only relayed through a corporate security consultant who reported to Camille's boss, Ronan Vexley. That name kept resurfacing. He began researching Vexley's ties, found a LinkedIn post about his bonus being tied to a data migration project, a Reddit post in a tech forum questioning internal ethics at Draper and Langston, a local civil suit dismissed but telling. Motive was emerging. But Elijah didn't just want to suggest Camille was innocent. He wanted to prove someone else was guilty. By 6:00 p.m., he had compiled timeline discrepancies, badge access logs from past cases, examples of faulty warrants, definitions of chain of custody violations. He wrote a list: problem, no signed warrant shown. Motive: Vexley had financial gain if Camille took the fall. Conflict: investigator had known ties to Vexley. Evidence: still missing a witness, still missing a timestamp. And then his pen stopped. He needed eyes. Someone inside the building. Someone the system overlooked. Someone invisible. He thought of the janitor. The next morning, Elijah was outside Draper and Langston's side service entrance by 7:15 a.m. He waited, heart pounding in his chest, until he saw a man in a navy jumpsuit pushing a trash bin down the corridor. "Mr. Tobias," the janitor looked up startled. "You the Grant kid?" Elijah nodded. "I need to talk." Mr. Tobias looked around, sighed, and motioned him inside. 5 minutes. That's all." Inside the dim storage hallway, Elijah laid it out. Vexley's after-hours accessed the security gaps, the lack of physical oversight. And then he asked, "Do you remember seeing him that night?" Mr. Tobias rubbed his chin. "Yeah, I saw him. Midnight, had a USB stick, looked like he was trying to beat the cameras." Elijah's heart pounded. "Would you say that in court?" The janitor laughed low and bitter. "Kid him a felon from 1986. I could say I saw Jesus hacking a server and no one would believe me." "But I would," Elijah said. "And if I can believe you, maybe the court will have to." Mr. Tobias stared at him a long time, then slowly reached into his locker and pulled out a photo. Grainy, dated, time-stamped. It showed Vexley standing alone in the server room after midnight one day before Camille's arrest. "You didn't get this from me," he said. Elijah's hands trembled as he took the photo. He nodded. "Thank you." Back at home that night, he scanned the photo, backed it up to cloud storage, and slipped a copy into his notebook. He stared at it long into the night at the blurred figure holding a USB stick caught in the act. Not just suspicion anymore. Now he had proof. It was barely past 8:00 a.m. when Elijah stepped into the Baltimore legal aid office, the place smelling like burnt coffee and despair. The walls were lined with faded posters reminding citizens of their rights. Ironic, he thought, considering what had just happened to his mother. He sat on a plastic chair outside room 302, notebook balanced on his lap, waiting for anyone to care enough to listen. Adults paced past him, muttering into phones, eyes glassy with fatigue. No one paid him attention. To them, he was just a teenager, just another boy wasting time. But Elijah wasn't wasting a second. Finally, the door creaked open. A woman emerged, blonde hair in a messy bun, a bitten bagel in one hand, and exhaustion in her eyes. Her badge read J. Flannery, Public Defender. She didn't even look at him. "Miss Flannery," Elijah said, rising to his feet. "I'm Elijah Grant, Camille Grant's son. I need to speak with you." She sighed, clearly annoyed. "Sweetheart, I'm already assigned to your mother's case, and I've got 6 more hearings before lunch. If you have something to say, jot it down and give it to the clerk." "I have evidence," Elijah replied, lifting his spiral notebook. "Proof that the warrant was invalid, and that her boss, Ronan Vexley, had motive and access. I even have a photo." Flannery stopped mid-step. "What did you just say?" He opened the notebook, flipping to the pages he'd carefully constructed the night before. Diagram of the office layout, notes on Vexley's bonus structure, security policy inconsistencies, the grainy time-stamped image showing Vexley inside the server room at 12:04 a.m. on the night in question. She stared at it, then at him. "Where did you get this, janitor?" He saw Vexley. He took the photo. Flannery blinked. "You're just a kid. You're not supposed to be reading this kind of material." "I know. But I did, because my mother's sitting in a holding cell for something she didn't do, and nobody else seems to care." Flannery looked around, suddenly aware of the hallway camera above her head, and lowered her voice. "Look, I've seen hundreds of these cases. A person of color gets accused by a corporate superior, and the court swallows it whole. That's just how it is. Even if I push, the judge pushes back harder. It's a no-win situation." Elijah's voice turned cold. "So you're not even going to try?" She hesitated, then muttered, "Best I can probably get is a plea deal. 5 years, maybe 3 with good behavior." "She didn't do anything," Elijah snapped. "And the system doesn't care." Flannery shot back, her voice raw. "Not unless you have something airtight, something that can't be ignored." He pointed at the photo again. "That's why I'm here." That afternoon in courtroom 4B, Camille Grant was let in, wearing an orange jumpsuit. Her hair was tied back, her wrists in cuffs. The courtroom was mostly empty, just a bailiff, the prosecutor, and a few onlookers. Elijah sat in the second-row, notebook in his lap, jaw clenched. Judge Morton Hollister, known for his no-nonsense demeanor and contempt for emotional appeals, adjusted his glasses and tapped his gavel. "Camille Grant, he said you stand accused of data theft, unauthorized access, and digital tampering." "Do you understand the charges?" "I do," she said quietly. The prosecutor, a tall man with a combed-over scalp and a smug voice, rose and began reading the charges like he was reciting a grocery list. Flannery sat motionless, offering no real defense. No rebuttals, no evidence. Just procedural nods and weak objections. When the judge asked if Camille had anything to say, she looked up. I'm not guilty, she said, voice steady but low. Someone set me up. Judge Hollister smirked. So noted. He turned to Flannery. Bail remains at $30,000. Trial date set for 3 weeks from today. And then Elijah stood, without permission, without fear. Your Honor, he said loudly that evidence was planted. Everyone turned. Even Flannery froze in place. Sit down, young man, she hissed. This isn't your place. But Elijah's voice didn't waver. My name is Elijah Grant. That's my mother. And I have proof that Ronan Vexley accessed the server room at a time when my mother wasn't even on the premises. Hollister squinted. This is a courtroom, not a sandbox. Sit down or I'll hold you in contempt. Elijah stepped forward anyway. I have security logs, access records, a photo, and a witness. My mother never had after-hours clearance. Vexley did. He had motive. His bonus was tied to the migration project. If something went wrong, he needed a fall person. Gasps rippled. The prosecutor stood abruptly, flustered. Flannery buried her face in her hands. The judge pounded the gavel. Order! But Elijah didn't flinch. Why are you afraid of the truth? He asked, voice sharp. The room went still. Judge Hollister stared at him for a long moment. Approach the bench, he finally said. Elijah walked forward, notebook in hand. Flannery chased after him, whispering furiously, What are you doing? You're going to ruin everything. I'm trying to save her, Elijah replied. Hollister took the notebook, eyes scanning through the handwritten notes, the evidence, the photo. His brow furrowed. He looked up. Where did you get all this? I studied. I asked questions. I found someone who saw what others didn't. A janitor. Yes. The judge sat back in his chair, the notebook still open in front of him. This material is incomplete, possibly inadmissible, but it's true, Elijah said. The judge was quiet. Then he turned to the bailiff. Take the boy into temporary custody. I want a private conversation with him before I decide how to proceed. Camille stood abruptly. No, don't touch him, but Elijah didn't resist. As he was escorted from the courtroom, he looked back at his mother and said, calm, as the sky before a storm, I'm not done. I swear I'm not done. The holding room was small, cold, and fluorescent lit, the kind of room designed to make you feel small, regardless of who you were. Elijah sat at a steel table with his backpack placed neatly on the floor beside him, his spiral notebook now in Judge Hollister's hands. His foot tapped involuntarily, not out of fear, but out of pure adrenaline. 15 minutes passed. Then the door opened. Judge Hollister entered alone. No bailiff, no clerks. Just a man in a black robe and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He didn't speak at first. He closed the door, walked slowly across the room, and took a seat opposite Elijah, laying the notebook between them. You want to know what I think? He asked calmly. Elijah nodded once. I think you're reckless, the judge said. I think what you did today would have gotten most people escorted out in cuffs. Interrupting a hearing, speaking out of turn. You could have jeopardized your mother's entire defense. Elijah stared at him. But I didn't. No, Hollister admitted. You didn't. He opened the notebook again, flipping to the photo Elijah had glued beside his notes. The grainy still of Ronan Vexley in the server room. Time-stamped. Dated. Labeled. This could have been fake, the judge said. It wasn't. Chain of custody taken by a janitor. Otis Tobias. He saw it happen. He saved the image before security wiped the footage the next morning. And you trust him. I trust what he saw. And I trust that no one else bothered to ask. Hollister tapped his fingers on the table slowly. You're 17. Yes, sir. You're not a lawyer. I never claimed to be. Then why do this? Elijah leaned forward, voice steady. Because I'm the only one who saw what was happening and cared enough to act. If the law isn't going to protect people like my mom, then I'll learn the law and use it better than the ones who weaponize it. That made Hollister pause. He sat back in his chair, letting the silence fill the room. You think justice is a tool? He asked. No, Elijah answered. I think it's a language, and I'm tired of watching people like us being silenced because we don't speak it fluently. The judge exhaled, closed the notebook, and rested his hand on it. You're articulate, focused, probably smarter than some of the interns I get from Georgetown. But I need more than passion. Elijah reached into his backpack, pulled out a small flash drive, and slid it across the table. There's more on there. Access logs, internal emails between Vexley and the private security firm. He tried to erase them, but the metadata stayed. Hollister raised an eyebrow. I used a public records terminal at the library, Elijah continued. Miss Alvarez helped me gain temporary guest access. Everything on that drive is verifiable. No tricks, no edits, just truth. The judge picked up the flash drive, weighing it in his palm like it was heavier than plastic. "I'll review this," he said finally. "But understand me, Mr. Grant. If you're lying, if you fabricated any of this, you will not only have hurt your mother's case, you'll destroy your credibility permanently." "I'm not lying," Elijah said. Hollister nodded, standing up. "Then let's see how deep this goes." He walked to the door, then paused. "You're not a lawyer yet, Mr. Grant," he said without turning around. "But one day you just might be." That afternoon, the court recessed early. Rumors began spreading through the halls of the courthouse about the photo, the logs, the teenager who had faced down the system with nothing but a notebook and fire in his gut. Camille, still in custody, received word from Flannery just before lights out. "He made the judge listen," her attorney said. "That's not easy." "But he did it." Camille closed her eyes. A single tear rolled down her cheek. She whispered, "I told him not to get involved." The next morning, Elijah returned to courtroom 4B with Mrs. Raines by his side. His mother wasn't present. She wouldn't be transferred again until pre-trial, but Judge Hollister was on the bench. The prosecutor looked visibly less smug. Flannery had a renewed sharpness to her tone. "Your Honor," she began, "in light of new evidence presented by the defense and verified by this court, we request an evidentiary hearing be opened immediately." Judge Hollister adjusted his glasses. Motion granted. The gavel struck. Whispers echoed. The case had shifted, and everyone knew it. Back home that night, Elijah sat at the kitchen table in the dark, his notebook open in front of him. Outside, the street lamps buzzed like angry bees. Inside, the silence hummed with possibility. He drew a timeline. Added a new name, Detective Farrow, the officer who signed off on the faulty search warrant. Elijah didn't recognize the name before, but now it stood out. He wrote a single sentence beneath it. Who gave the tip? Why seal the source? Then he wrote another. Justice doesn't shout, but it remembers everything. And finally he closed the notebook, looked out the window, and whispered to himself, "They're listening now, and I'm not done." The following week moved like quicksand, slow from the outside, but beneath the surface everything was shifting. Judge Hollister had quietly signed off on a subpoena for Ronan Vexley, ordering him to appear in a closed-door deposition. The court was no longer entertaining a routine prosecution. It was investigating potential misconduct from within. Elijah wasn't allowed in the deposition, but he sat on the hallway bench just outside, listening to the muffled voices inside room 3C, his knees bouncing with quiet anticipation. Flannery paced beside him, clutching her legal pad like a shield. For the first time since their awkward first meeting, she seemed respectful. Not just of what Elijah had done, but of who he was. "Let me be clear," she whispered. "Depositions are where the truth gets cornered. But people like Vexley, they've had years to polish their lies. If he slips up, it won't be because he's nervous, it'll be because we're better prepared." Elijah nodded. "Then let's make sure we are." 2 hours later, the door opened. Vexley stepped out. First, his face flushed. Not angry, embarrassed. His tie was loosened, his collar wrinkled. For a man who once strutted through the Draper and Langston lobby like he owned the place today, he looked human, fallible. Judge Hollister followed shortly after, silent, unreadable. He gave a subtle nod to Flannery as he passed, but said nothing. That was enough. Flannery sat down beside Elijah, flipping open her notes. He denied everything she said, claimed the photo was taken out of context, claimed the access logs were incomplete and technically irrelevant. But when I asked him what he was doing in a restricted server room at midnight without a tech badge, she smiled for the first time in days. He didn't have an answer. Back at the legal aid office, Elijah met again with Otis Tobias, the janitor, who had taken the photo that sparked it all. They sat together in the break room, a tiny tiled space with a flickering light and the smell of microwave spaghetti hanging in the air. "You sure you want to go through with this?" Otis asked, stirring sugar into a styrofoam cup of coffee. They're going to try to discredit you, Elijah said plainly. They're going to dig up your past and throw it at the jury. Otis sipped. Let 'em. I did time. I did dumb things. But I know what I saw. And if the truth makes people uncomfortable, good. It should. Elijah slid a printed copy of the subpoena across the table. Then I need you on record. Otis nodded slowly. Put me under oath. 2 days later, Judge Hollister announced a special evidentiary hearing to determine whether the charges against Camille Grant would be dismissed outright or if the case would move to full trial. The courtroom was more crowded than usual. Word had leaked through legal circles, through whispered phone calls, maybe even through a certain teenage boy who had spoken to the editor of the high school newspaper. By 10:00 a.m., reporters occupied the back 2 rows. Legal clerks whispered anxiously behind notepads, and a sketch artist had taken up position in the corner with a pencil already moving. Camille, wearing a slate gray suit borrowed from Mrs. Raines, sat beside Flannery with her chin lifted. No cuffs, no jumpsuit. Today she was no longer the accused. Today she was the witness. Elijah sat behind them, notebook in hand, eyes locked on the front of the courtroom. Judge Hollister entered and called the session to order. The court will now hear arguments regarding the newly introduced photographic evidence badge access logs and the credibility of Mr. Ronan Vexley's testimony, he said. The prosecution looked tense, not panicked, not yet, but no longer in control. Flannery rose. Your Honor, I call Otis Tobias to the stand. Otis walked slowly to the front of the room. His uniform was pressed, his shoulders straight. The courtroom went still. After he was sworn in, Flannery approached with the photo in hand. Mr. Tobias, can you confirm when and where this photo was taken? Draper and Langston, 10th floor, server corridor. July 14th. Timestamps accurate. And who is depicted in this image? That's Ronan Vexley. I seen him there. Midnight. Carrying a USB drive and looking over his shoulder like he already knew he didn't belong. Did you report this to anyone at the time? No, ma'am. Folks like me report things, we lose jobs. But I kept a copy, just in case someone ever asked. Why did you keep it? Otis glanced toward Elijah. Because someone finally did. There was a ripple through the courtroom, subtle but unmistakable. The prosecutor stood adjusting his cuffs. Mr. Tobias, isn't it true that you have a criminal record dating back to 1986? Yes, sir. I was stupid. Did my time. Came out clean. 32 years, no trouble. And yet you expect us to take your word against a respected executive? Otis leaned into the mic. You don't have to take my word. You just have to look at the damn picture. The courtroom broke into murmurs. Judge Hollister banged the gavel twice. Order. As Otis stepped down, Elijah felt his chest tighten. Not with fear, but with a feeling he hadn't tasted since the morning of the arrest. Hope. Real, tangible hope. And it wasn't just about his mom anymore. It was about the system being forced for once to look a black man in the eye and listen. Judge Hollister addressed the courtroom. This court acknowledges the significance of the testimony and photographic evidence. The prosecution will have 48 hours to present a rebuttal or move for dismissal. Elijah sat frozen, the words echoing in his mind. The case was no longer one-sided, and maybe, just maybe, the system was beginning to blink. Teen boy uncovers evidence that may clear his mother in corporate espionage case. That was the headline plastered across local news sites, accompanied by a photo of Elijah walking into the courthouse, notebook in hand, head held high. Some called him the boy lawyer. Others called him a vigilante. But no one called him invisible anymore. At school, whispers followed him like shadows. Some students looked at him with awe, others with confusion. One kid even tried to ask for a selfie. Elijah ignored them all. He didn't care about being recognized. He cared about what came next. Because while the courtroom had started to listen, power doesn't lose quietly. Back at the legal aid office, Flannery paced the hallway with a phone pressed to her ear, tension stiff in her posture. Elijah waited outside her office, his backpack on the floor, hands clenched in his lap. When she finally emerged, her expression had darkened. They're pushing back, she said without preamble. Who? Elijah asked. Draper and Langston's legal team. They filed an emergency motion to suppress the photo, claiming it was obtained illegally and violates internal privacy statutes. And they're challenging Otis' testimony as inadmissible due to his prior convictions. But none of that changes the truth. Flannery met his eyes. You're right. But the truth doesn't always win. Not in a courtroom, not when corporations with deep pockets start twisting procedure. Elijah stood up. So what do? We get ahead of it. That afternoon, Flannery submitted a preemptive brief arguing that the public interest in fair prosecution outweighed any supposed privacy infringement. She cited case after case, Illinois versus Gates people versus Pearson, even Gideon versus Wainwright. Her language was surgical, her tone sharp, but they both knew the motion was just one part of the war. That night, Elijah couldn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table in silence, surrounded by case files, transcripts, and printed pages. His mother was in the bedroom, finally home on pre-trial release, but emotionally distant. She hadn't said much since her return, her voice quiet, her smile hollow. Like freedom didn't feel real yet. Elijah, she said softly from the hallway. You should rest. I can't, he replied. She approached, sat across from him, and placed a hand over his. I don't know how to say thank you for what you've done, she said. You don't have to. I'm just trying to finish what they tried to bury. She looked down. I never wanted you to carry this. I know, he said, voice firm, but I'm not putting it down. 2 days later, they were back in court. The prosecution walked in with 2 new lawyers, corporate counsel sent from Draper and Langston's legal team. One wore a Rolex, the other carried a sleek leather briefcase and a quiet confidence that came from crushing cases with loopholes, not evidence. They didn't attack the facts. They attacked the people. Your Honor, one began, we submit that Mr. Tobias' testimony is not only questionable, but potentially coerced by a minor with no legal standing. He turned to Elijah, seated behind Flannery. The boy may be passionate, but he is not an officer of the court. He has no authority to conduct discovery, collect statements, or handle sensitive corporate information. This entire proceeding has been contaminated by vigilante interference. Flannery stood before Judge Hollister could respond. With respect, Your Honor, that boy uncovered information this court should have demanded from the outset. If it weren't for his diligence, we would still be working from assumptions, not facts. The prosecutor stepped forward. The law into hobby, Miss Flannery. If anyone can walk into court with a school notebook and derail a criminal prosecution, we've lost the foundation of due process. Elijah's face burned. He wanted to shout to fight back, but he remembered what Miss Alvarez had told him weeks ago in the library. The law isn't always loud. Sometimes it wins by being unshakably correct. Judge Hollister looked from one side to the other, then down at Elijah. Mr. Grant, he said, voice level. Do you understand the seriousness of your involvement? Yes, sir. Do you believe your actions compromise the fairness of these proceedings? Elijah stood. No, Your Honor. I believe my actions restored fairness. When the system failed my mom, I didn't break the rules, I read them. I followed them, and I found the truth you weren't being given. There was a long pause. Then Hollister said, motion to suppress is denied. The photo stands. The testimony stands. And this court will continue with an evidentiary review. Gasps, then silence. Then murmurs of disbelief. The corporate lawyers exchanged glances. Their opening move had failed. Outside, the courthouse cameras were waiting. Flannery tried to shield Camille and Elijah as they made their way down the stairs, but reporters were relentless. Elijah, do you want to be a lawyer someday, Ms. Grant? Do you think your son saved your life? Do you believe the system failed you? Elijah turned just for a second. I think the system finally listened, because we made it impossible not to. That night, Otis dropped off a flash drive at Elijah's apartment. It contained footage from a forgotten hallway camera. Grainy but clear Vexley entering the restricted server room, then exiting 10 minutes later with an external drive in hand. No one else appeared in the video. No Camille. No team. No tech staff. Found it buried in an archive, Otis said. Nobody checks the service corridor cameras unless something explodes. Guess this counts. Elijah stared at the screen. His heart pounded. This wasn't a theory anymore. It was proof. The final day of the hearing arrived with a sky heavy and low, the kind of gray that made everything feel more serious, more final. Downtown Baltimore bustled like any other weekday, but inside courtroom 4B, the air was different, heavier. Elijah stood at the courthouse steps with Camille beside him. She looked stronger now. Not because she had healed, no one comes out of a wrongful arrest unscarred, but because she no longer had to carry the burden alone. Her son stood with her notebook tucked under his arm like armor. Inside, every seat was filled. Reporters, legal observers, students from the local university's law program, even Judge Hollister's former clerk, had taken a spot in the back row. The weight of public attention had shifted. This was no longer a closed case. It was a reckoning. Judge Hollister entered precisely at 9:00 a.m., robed, pristine, eyes sharper than ever. We are here to deliver closing arguments, and if the evidence allows, issue a formal ruling on the motion to dismiss charges against Camille Grant. Flannery stood slowly, taking a deep breath. She wore a navy blazer today, no frills, no performance. Her voice didn't need height, it needed gravity. Your Honor, she began, this case was presented to this court as a simple story. A woman committed a crime, and the system caught her. But the truth is rarely simple. And in this courtroom, truth has been obscured by power, by assumption, and by silence. She turned toward Camille. This is a woman who worked 17 years without incident, never reprimanded, never investigated, a woman who lived by the rules even when they never protected her. Flannery raised the photograph, then the hallway footage, then the access logs. These are not allegations. These are facts. Mr. Vexley accessed the system. Mr. Vexley had motive. Mr. Vexley lied. She paused. And none of this came to light because of a high-priced legal team or a whistleblower hotline. It came from a 17-year-old boy who refused to let his mother be erased. Her voice cracked slightly, not for show, but because some truths are too sharp to touch without bleeding. Elijah Grant didn't just uncover the truth. He restored faith in a system that tried to swallow him whole. She sat down. For a moment there was silence. Then the prosecutor stood visibly rattled. We do not contest the authenticity of the documents, he began awkwardly. However, we still argue that the defendant was negligent, that her password may have been used. Judge Hollister held up a hand. Counselor, he said, voice firm, do you have any direct evidence linking Camille Grant to the data breach? The prosecutor's jaw clenched. No, Your Honor. Then you may be seated. The courtroom stilled. Judge Hollister removed his glasses, folded his hands on the bench, and let the silence stretch until the room leaned forward to meet it. Camille Grant. He said this court has reviewed all submitted evidence, including testimony, security logs, photographic material, and digital records. Based on the totality of what has been presented, the court finds insufficient grounds to proceed with prosecution. He paused, his eyes flicking toward the prosecution. All charges are hereby dismissed with prejudice. Gasps, whispers, and then applause. Camille exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for weeks. Elijah leaned forward, forehead in his hands shaking slightly. Not from sadness, from release. Judge Hollister raised his gavel once more. One more note before we adjourn. The room fell silent again. There's been much discussion in this courtroom about who is allowed to speak, about who gets to uncover the truth. Mr. Elijah Grant, he said, looking directly at him, you reminded this court and perhaps this country that the law is not the property of the powerful. It belongs to those with the courage to learn it, challenge it, and hold it to its own standard. He nodded. Well done, son. Outside, the courthouse steps were alive with flashing cameras and microphones. But Elijah didn't stop. Not for interviews, not for headlines. He walked with his mother hand in hand past the crowds, past the chaos. She was free. That was all that mattered. Otis waited by the curb in his dented blue sedan engine, humming. He rolled down the window. I heard he said, hell of a thing. Camille leaned in. Thank you, Otis. For everything. He shrugged. You raised a storm in that boy. All I did was not get in its way. That evening they gathered at Mrs. Reynos' apartment. Nothing fancy. Just stew on the stove, soft jazz on the radio, and a quiet sense that something sacred had been restored. Flannery showed up with a bottle of sparkling cider and a real smile, the kind that doesn't come easy to lawyers who spend their lives putting out fires that no one else sees. They toasted not just to freedom, but to truth that refused to stay buried. A week later, a letter arrived in the mailbox. Handwritten, no return address. It read, Elijah. Your work in that courtroom was noticed far beyond Baltimore. We run a program at Howard Law School for students like you, brilliant minds with the guts to question power. We'd like you to attend a summer intensive this July, full scholarship. Keep reading, keep writing, keep fighting. Justice M.K. Reardon Rhett. Elijah read it twice, then handed it to Camille, who covered her mouth with both hands. He looked out the window at the city that once tried to forget his mother and smiled. Not because he won, but because for the first time the law had looked him in the eye and listened. In a world where justice often feels distant and the powerful too often go unchecked, this story reminds us of something profoundly human. The law may be written in books, but it lives through the courage of those who dare to speak up. Elijah Grant, a 17-year-old boy with nothing more than a notebook and a relentless love for his mother, confronted a system built to ignore voices like his. And through perseverance, clarity, and moral conviction, he made that system listen. For older Americans, many of whom have seen decades of promises broken and headlines repeated, Elijah's journey isn't just inspirational, it's familiar. It echoes the same resilience many of you carried through civil rights marches, economic downturns, and moments where you had to fight twice as hard just to be heard once. The lesson here is timeless justice doesn't always shout, it listens. But it only listens when we speak. Whether you're a parent, a neighbor, or a voter, your voice matters. Quiet integrity, consistent truth, and the refusal to look away can ripple farther than any courtroom verdict. This story invites us not just to applaud the brave, but to become part of the legacy they build, to keep asking questions, to keep standing up, and to never underestimate the power of clarity in the hands of someone who refuses to give up. Because justice at its core is not about loud voice, it's about true ones. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of a time when you had to stand up for someone you love, or when truth had to fight to be heard, then take a moment to support Elijah. He may be young, but his courage speaks volumes. What would you have done if it were your son, your daughter, your friend in that courtroom? Share your thoughts in the comments, because your voice matters too. Elijah stood for justice when no one else would. Let's stand with him now. If you believe in truth and family and in the quiet strength it takes to do what's right, then show your support. And if you like this video, please comment the number 1 below so Elijah knows he's not alone.